By the time students hit fourth or fifth grade, they're really good at bubbling in these bubble sheets. However, something that they are not very good at is using multiple texts on a reading comprehension test. So, since most state tests are providing students with lots of different texts to use to answer questions, and it's getting very confusing and hard for students to keep things organized in the test, we can help our students get better test scores by focusing on this particular skill. So our main focus in this video is talking about how to help students learn how to tackle the reading comprehension test by going step by step and keeping organized and annotating on multiple texts. But it goes a little bit beyond text annotation, so I'm going to be showing you some very specific skills and giving you some other tips that you can use to help your students do better on their reading comprehension test. The first thing I tell my students to do is to read any questions. So they have no idea what kind of information they're looking for in these texts that they're provided until they actually read the questions. And in addition to reading the questions, I have them write down notes. So it really depends on what your students are allowed to write and where they're supposed to write. So if they have any sort of scratch paper, or if they can write on the text booklet, or if they can digitally annotate on the test, that's super helpful because they can actually start to write down information that they need to be looking for. So if they're seeing that there's a question on their reading test that's asking about main idea of a particular piece of a text or multiple main ideas, they can write down, I need to be looking for main idea. So this is very helpful because this allows for students to know what they need to be looking for, but also writing it down is helpful because they'll get into that text and they'll forget what those questions were. So any way that students can write notes on what they are looking for in the text is very helpful. The next thing I have students do is to read the first text. So if they're given multiple texts for a few questions, they need to read that first text and annotate that first text and look for the answers to the questions. However, I tell them do not answer the question until you have read that second text, because you never know, you might find a better answer in that second text, or you may need both texts to answer the question. So part of this is just practicing what do we need to do to figure out which text to use, how to organize our information, and how to get the best answer. Because there's always answers on the test that are very similar, and when you have multiple texts to use, it can be really tricky for students. So next, students read the second text. They do the same thing. They're annotating. They're looking for answers to those common questions that they're having on the test about that text. Finally, we're reading the questions again, and we're going back and we're pulling from those two texts things that we've annotated, looking at our notes, having students circle what they found, where they found the answer, and that's how we're answering those questions. So this does seem like kind of a simple process if students learn to do it, but one of the issues is that we don't really get good at doing these types of questions until we've practiced it a lot. Now, the issue we have with practicing over and over and over for test prep is students get really burned out. So I highly recommend you do not practice the bubble sheet very often unless your students really need it, because I don't want them to feel like they're practicing for the test and maybe doing something that isn't really worth their time. What I want them to focus on is working on texts that are really engaging and interesting. So my number one tip for teaching this strategy is that you choose text that's really interesting to your students. Now, the text on your state test might not be so interesting, but we don't want students to burn out, so we always want to choose things based off of topics that they're interested in. So one of our favorite topics is the Guinness Book of World Records, and so I'm able to bring in multiple texts in order to practice these step-by-step strategies. So we love that topic. You can find lots of different texts on it. I actually have a resource with the text done, so definitely check out the link in the description. But what's really extra cool about this is that we can tailor it to our students' interests so that they are engaged and they're practicing and they're learning, but they're not feeling like they're doing test prep, which is really overwhelming and boring. So let's talk about written responses because this is where things get even more complicated. So if your students are doing written responses on their reading comprehension test, we need to be practicing that in class as well. We can use the same text that we've been practicing answering questions about to write those written responses. So what we want to do is we want to have a particular organizer for students so that they have a format that they can use for any written response. And we're bringing in a lot of those writing skills to talk about what we want students to be doing, things like capitalizing their sentences, using correct punctuation, making sure to go back and edit their sentences, and so forth. But ultimately, we are keeping that very basic because what we're looking for the most on that is the actual content of what they got from the reading text. One of the things that teachers struggle with in this process is that they'll practice all of this whole group with students, and then students will get to the test and they won't feel confident enough to do it independently. They'll just rush through it, they won't use their strategies, and so forth. So my number one most favorite thing to do to prepare for the test is to slowly taper my students off of getting my help with these activities, to start with whole group, slowly move them to working in a small group, slowly move them to working in partners, and then eventually working independently. So every single step of the way, whether we're whole group, small group, partners, or individually, we're using the same exact process. This process over and over and over again. By the time they get to that independent practice, they're pretty confident in doing that process. And the great thing about that independent process is that while they're doing it, I can walk around and say, hey, don't forget, and I can give them a checklist and I can give them annotation reminders. I can let them use highlighters. I can let them do all sorts of things because it's not the actual test yet. But by the time they get to the test, they are going to be ready to tackle it. So one more thing to remember about that too is as you slowly taper them towards independent work, do not have them be doing these problems independently for weeks and weeks and weeks. Maybe a few days or a week at the most working independently practicing this because we don't want them to get burnt out before the test. So the best thing I could say is to look at your calendar, look at when your reading test is, get your materials together and decide what days are we working whole group, when are we going to slowly transition to small group, when are we going to move to partners, when are we going to work independently, and when is our test going to finally happen and we can put all of that together. So those are my best tips for tackling multiple texts on a reading comprehension test. I hope that everyone has a good state test this year. Wish we didn't have to do it, but it is what it is. And the best thing that we can do for our students is to make sure that they enjoy any activities that we're giving them that are test prep. So remember to keep it very engaging and very exciting for your students, and try to keep the tedious test prep items away from your classroom. If you liked this video, please make sure to like it, subscribe, and if you have any questions at all, leave them in the comment box below. I'll make sure to get on and answer your questions.